As we barrel into 2020's election season, and more of the candidates we've been following all year turn into afterthoughts based on polling, the platform of I hate Donald Trump the most is just not going to cut it anymore. And many of these candidates are actually going to have to come up with a coherent platform that they can run on. Now, there's pressure from the mainstream sources that make many of these candidates think that they still have a shot, even though most of the candidates out there really don't, especially after Biden announced that he's running. But Cory Booker unveiled a plan to put an agenda into place that is going to put him back into national prominence and make people start talking about him again. This past week, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey rolled out an idea that he plans to enact if he becomes the President of the United States, and it will change the way that we look at guns and gun sales in this country. There are several parts to the plan, and I'm going to discuss two of the bigger ones, and I'm going to talk about several of the smaller ones towards the end of the video. But the first part of Booker's plan is to change the way that we buy guns. Now, Booker's idea is that for any new purchase out there, anybody who wants to buy any sort of firearm is going to have a federal license to buy. We're also going to have licenses to own firearms, but that's not going to be something that's going to be rolled out right away. That's something that they're going to try and roll out in increments after we make it so that anybody who wants to buy has the license already. And finally, you are going to have to renew your license every 5 years if you want to continue to own or purchase firearms. Now, the licensing requirements for this seem to be similar to licensing yourself to buy a car, and I think that's part of the idea that he wants to put forward in this. From what I've seen from every article that I've read about this, there is a comparable idea to owning a car. Therefore, Booker wants you to have to pass a background check, of course, to get your license to buy a firearm. And I hope this will waive your background check every time you buy a firearm if, for whatever reason, this should get implemented. But you also have to go through and take a class and get a mental assessment before you can get the licensing. And this just has problems written on it right from the start. Now, right out of the gate, the first thing that we see is the text of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and that seems to be the thing that Senator Booker seems to forget when he puts these ideas forwards. Shall not be infringed falls on a federal level, and it seems to be what Booker has forgotten about. Now, one of the citations that Booker wants to talk about, and this is something I have debated numerous times both on and off camera, is the fact that many states do have laws similar to this one. And I am okay with states having the laws to this one. The federal constitution does not restrict or limit the rights of the states to exercise their own sovereignty. Rather, when we look at the Constitution as a whole, the rights that are enumerated in the Constitution and the limits that are put on the federal government in the document itself, we see the idea that if one state wants to enact these laws, as many states already have, the people of the states who do not agree with these laws do have the freedom to move to another state that does not have these laws. Therefore, the Second Amendment bars the federal government from implementing such a law. And yes, I understand the fact that there are federal background checks. I do disagree with those on the whole, but I do understand the idea of preventing a person from Illinois, who has a domestic abuse on his record, from going over to Missouri and buying a gun and then carrying it back over to Illinois. Now, Interstate Commerce steps into play for that, but without a federal background check, that does get a little bit dicey, and I don't see a better way, but I do hope that someday we do find a better way in this country. Now, as I mentioned before, a lot of the ideas that Booker put forward in the licensing idea are compared to cars, and now I understand why Booker wants to draw this comparison. Cars can be deadly if they are in the wrong hands, just as firearms can be, but the biggest idea, and National Review knocks this right out of the park, I'll be citing them again a little bit later, but National Review points out the fact that cars are not an enumerated right in the Constitution. Now, Yes, we didn't have cars back then, but we never had the right to transportation. We can just sit and stay at home if we really wanted to, according to the federal government. But we do have the right to keep and bear arms to protect ourselves from all enemies, foreign, domestic, and in order to feed ourselves if we choose to hunt to get our food. Similar to the idea of having to license in order to keep or purchase a firearm, Booker also introduced an idea of a federal gun registry, partially because some states do this and partially because some of the countries that progressives look to for everything also do this. But there are also problems with this idea. When you're talking about licensing in order to purchase and own firearms, it's very easy to make comparisons to owning a car, and a national registry of firearms on paper looks like the exact same thing. You register your firearm and you let the government know that you own that particular firearm and where it is kept. And on paper, again, that looks like a very easy thing. But National Review talks about the realities of the registry, especially in the future as more and more progressive governments come into power in this country. Once you have a registry of firearms, you have a federal map of all of the guns in the country, where they are registered to, the address that they are kept at, and who is carrying them. And if we do, for whatever reason, come to a point where our federal government and the Constitution collapses, we're looking at a very easy map for the federal government to come around and use this to try and disarm us. Now, I'm not tinfoily enough to go out there and say that this is definitely going to happen, or that any public politician on the left has come right out and said that this is what they want to do. But one can't help but see that this is a possibility in a world where the left in this country is pushing so hard to have such a registry, and also pushing so hard to try and push gun culture out of this country. So it's definitely a possibility I don't want to think about, but it is definitely a possibility that is there. To take this a step further, registry and licensing of firearms both lead to a very dystopian idea that we as citizens would have to provide the government a good reason for us to own guns. And I'm not saying this lightly. I'm saying this to the fact that there are states out there that have tossed this idea around on their state levels, and there are progressive safe havens out there that the progressives in this country look to that do have laws like this in place. And this picture sums up perfectly the attitude that we should have about the idea that we need to provide the government a good reason for us to own a gun. The people of most of these countries do descend from people who lived under monarchies. The people were possessions of the monarchs, and they had to provide the government with a good reason for everything that they wanted to do, especially if it could be dangerous to the government. And we are fortunate in this country to live under a government that has a document that enumerates our rights and limits the power of the federal government to take them away from us, rather than us being property of the federal government to get the rights that the government decides that we are allowed to have. Now, along with these more radical ideas that have caught the attention of most Americans, Booker did make some other bold assertions. He had the usual slew of universal background checks, whether it's a private sale or through a gun store, and the banning of assault weapons. Those are two things that right now in this country are really not going to go anywhere, but Booker also made a bold assertion that he wants to sit back and investigate the National Rifle Association for their tax-exempt status and their ability to influence elections. Once again, this is going to be something that isn't going to go anywhere, and Booker wants to go even further than this and lift all of the laws up there that protect gun manufacturers from being sued every time somebody uses one of their guns to commit a murder or any sort of crime. And that's going to go about as far as somebody wanting to sue General Motors for somebody going out, getting drunk, getting in their Chevrolet, and running down a bunch of pedestrians in the middle of the street. There's just no way to hold a manufacturer responsible for anything unless the action of your AR-15 blows up in your hands and suddenly you don't have any hands anymore. Senator Booker has been very ambitious about this entire idea, and I believe that he knows that he's never going to get any of these things through Congress. In fact, he has come out and said that he wants to enact almost all of them through an executive action. Now, the people on the left are so concerned when Trump takes any sort of executive action, especially the executive action to declare a national emergency to build a border wall. And a lot of them talked about the idea that they were going to use executive action and national emergency powers to enact an idea like this. But just like the border wall and just like any other executive action, the Congress does have the power to get this overridden, especially in the case of the national emergency that Cory Booker wants to declare in order to do this. So this would be a political fight that we would definitely see, because I'm sure that many of the people would rise up to try and defend their rights to defend themselves from a government that would be too tyrannical. There are two words that I've said a lot in this video, and those words are federal government. And that's of course because with Booker becoming the president, if he should happen to rise up to that rank, he would be enacting this from the Oval Office on all 50 states. And when we look at things like car registry, car licensing, driver's licensing, and any of the other comparisons that the advocates for all of these laws tried to draw when they were talking about the fact that we already do this with much deadlier items, the idea that they forget to mention is that licensing and registry for your automobiles and anything else that you license or register comes from the state level or even below. Think of your pets. Those are registered in your municipality. Their licenses and their tags come from the city that you live in. When I had my gun control debate with Robert from the Generational Gap, one of the big topics that came up that we talked about was the difference between a state infringing on the Second Amendment and the federal government. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there is a stark difference between the two. If the state of Wisconsin were to ever enact a gun control law that I did not agree with, that would force me to give up any of my firearms, I would not stick around Wisconsin to live under that law, no matter how much I love this state. I would be in Iowa so fast you wouldn't even know what happened to me. There would be an edge-shaped cloud of smoke in my studio, and I would be setting up a new studio over in Des Moines. And that's the idea of doing this between the federal government and the state governments, because if you don't agree with the laws in your state, you have the freedom to go and move to another state. I understand that it's hard, and we live in a generation that has the least mobility of many of the generations past, but you do still have that freedom to go find a state or a municipality whose laws you more agree with. Bringing this down on the federal level rings of tyranny, and it also makes sure that you can't escape from laws that you do not agree with. While I truly believe that this would be an interesting political battle to watch if anything like this were to ever get enacted by executive action, and it would be a great civics lesson for the majority of this country, I understand that statistically this is the last gasp of a 0% presidential candidate, and bringing it into the forefront, Cory Booker probably has the hopes that this will get picked up as a question in the debates, and one of the bigger candidates out there will pick up the idea and use it on his or her campaign. But in any case, I am glad this is out there, because this really shows the dark side of the progressive agenda. This shows the side that they tried to hide for so long, but they're no longer trying to hide it, and it gives the American people a chance to see what they're really voting for coming up in 2020. What do you think about licensing to purchase and own a firearm or a firearms registry? And what do you think Booker's chances are of getting to the end of the 2020 race? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comments section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.
You're always there.